Hello, it's Nigel Povah here again with another game from one of the masters who will be playing in the simultaneous display on the 11th of September. And this time we're going to see a game played by Andrew Martin, which is played in a correspondence game he played some years ago against a chap named Ljukmanov. It's a particularly interesting game, and we've got Ljukmanov playing as white, and the game opens with d4, and Andrew plays c4, g6. We get a King's Indian, and Ljukmanov chooses to play the same-ish variation, and Andrew plays a really unusual looking, rather strange looking move here, b6, rather flexible, and Andrew's thinking behind this is that he wants to see how white's going to continue, and he thinks he can create some good counterplay against the solid white structure, and he thinks it will give him some dynamic chances. Ljukmanov continues with the natural bishop e3, and Andrew plays another strange looking move, putting the bishop on b7, which is biting on granite on that pawn chain on e4 and f3. And indeed, when the white pawn comes to d5, it looks like that bishop will be even more cramped. But Andrew reasons that he'll get some counterplay, as you'll soon see. And one of his intentions here, or his thoughts here, is to try and avoid committing his king and to keep white guessing as to exactly where the king might end up residing. Anyway, Ljukmanov continues with queen to d2, and Andrew plays c5, a very natural move, and although it invites that d5 move, which would definitely mean the bishop on b7 will be somewhat shut out, and that's indeed what happens, what it does mean is that this bishop on g7 now is very powerful. It's now got great prospects on the long black diagonal, and this becomes an essential feature of this game. So Andrew now continues developing with his knight, and Ljukmanov plays a pretty standard lunge in the same as he plays h4. White's structure is all about set up for him to play on the king side and to mount a king side assault, and that's particularly effective if black has castle. But at the moment the black king is still on e8, and it's not sure that he is going to end up castling on the king side. It might have been better, therefore, if instead of h4, Ljukmanov had chosen knight h3. Keeps his options open, is less threatening in some ways, and might entice Andrew to castle kingside. Then white could play knight back to f2 perhaps, and then continue with the h4 plan. But as I say, that didn't happen. h4 was the chosen move, and Andrew doesn't castle into it, but continues developing on the queen side with a6, which is preparing a b5 type push. Ljukmanov decides that it's prudent to carry on developing his king side, so knight h3 was played, and Andrew now plays knight to e5. It's a good square for the knight. It radiates sort of power there, and also it deters the natural move g4, because the f3 pawn would be on prise, and knight takes f3 would be a disastrous king and queen fork. For that reason, bishop e2 was played by Ljukmanov to make sure f3 is well guarded, and he's now preparing the g4 response. So for that reason, Andrew plays h5 to prevent g4 from happening. So in this position, the knight drops to f2 to reinforce a possible g4, and now Andrew plays bishop to c8, which is again intending to prevent g4. But it also serves to declutter the b file so that black can advance with b5 at some stage and play down the b file. So we reach a very key moment in the game, because if white doesn't do something fairly drastic or serious, then black will eventually build up and force b5. So white plays bishop f4, which is quite a reasonable move. He's got the prospect or the possibility of capturing on e5. And Andrew played a rather provocative move now, which was rook a7, in effect inviting white to take on e5. And that's what white should have done. Had he played bishop takes e5, de, this was best, and now g4, white would be better in this position. There's no real worries for white, and he's the one that's got the attacking chances. But instead, white played a rather fatal decision. He decided to castle queenside rather than taking on e5. And now Andrew was able to prevent the capture on e5 having the same impact by playing knight back to d7. Any capture on e5 now would result in a piece recapture, and that would mean that the a8 to h1 diagonal would remain open. Sorry, the a1 to h8 diagonal rather. And that would be a problem for the white king who's sitting on the queen side. Anyway, white played king to b1 and Andrew now plays b5. Now this is in classic sort of Benko gambit style, but it's even better here because white has castled on the queen side. Black happily gives up a measly pawn in order to blast the open lines. And that's exactly what happens. White takes, and Andrew brings his queen out to a5. Rook comes to c1 to make sure the knight on c3 is well protected, and Andrew recaptures on b5, and now he's eyeing up this a pawn on a2 because he's threatening pawn on to b4, driving the knight away, followed by queen takes a2. So in order to avoid that possibility, and Ljukmanov takes the pawn on b5 with his bishop. But Andrew simply plays bishop to a6, which is a really good move because it gets rid of his ineffective bishop, which was sitting on c8, and it also prepares to bring the h8 rook into the game on the b file. So white captures on a6 and Andrew recaptures, and now white plays b3 to ensure that the a2 square can be well defended along the second rank. And at last now Andrew decides to castle and although this looks dangerous on the one hand because he's putting his king in the line of fire, white can advance with g4 and try and start an attack on the king side, but the problem for white is that black's attack on the queen side is more advanced and black's likely to break through more quickly, as we'll soon see. So Ljukmanov continued rather with g4, which would leave the f-pawn on prise. Instead he advanced his bishop into h6 in order to try and swap the dangerous bishop off and mount an attack directly against the black king with g4. But Andrew had foreseen this possibility and now comes up with a lovely move, which after this move the combinations on the board are absolutely rife. It's a fabulous move. And now white captures the knight on c4 because he had no choice. Because, for example, if he plays queen to f4, intending to keep the bishop on h6 guarded, there is a lovely finish here for Andrew. It would have been queen takes a2 check, only one reply, knight takes a2 forced, and now knight to a3 is mate, because the bishop on g7 is covering both a1 and b2, and the knight is covering both b1 and c2. A lovely finish that would have been had Ljukmanov played queen f4. But instead of that queen f4 move, Ljukmanov left the queen at home and took the knight off, which he had to do. And now Andrew plays check, which is very sensible, and after king to a1, which was the move played, well, let me show you, there is an alternative. If king to c2 trying to run away with king to d1 to follow, there is again a lovely tactic on the board, rook to b2 check. And after king to this would win the queen, other than king takes b2, but now we have queen takes a2 is mate, because this bishop on g7 pins the knight on c3, and therefore this will be a lovely finish to the game. So yet another lovely tactic, and both of these two tactics we've seen are both because of this wonderful bishop on g7. But anyway, after rook check, king c2 wasn't played, king a1 was, and now Andrew plays a lovely move, bishop back to h8. Fabulous move, very calm, and the fascinating thing about this position is that despite being a whole piece up, white is absolutely powerless to stop black invading, either with knight to e5 or knight to b6 to a4. Either way, the black knight is going to enter the game with devastating effect. And most of the threats that will follow are all based on the fact that this bishop on h8 just pins this knight to c3 and renders it entirely helpless to defend against the many threats that will follow. Anyway, white played knight f to d1, supporting the knight on c3, and Andrew doubles his rooks on the file. And there's not a lot white can do other than perhaps try and shut this long diagonal. So he plays rook e1, intending to play pawn to e5, closing the diagonal. But that's prevented by black putting his knight to e5. And now there's no answer to the threat of knight takes c4 and the threats that follow. And in fact, this was a correspondence game, as I mentioned earlier, and Ljukmanov could see that his position was hopeless, so he resigned. But just to illustrate how difficult his position is, say for example he'd continued with queen c2, now we have knight takes c4, and the intention is to play a move like queen to b6 and come in down the b file to b1, and the b1 is only guarded by queen and rook and not the knight because of the pin. So that would mean that maybe white's best move here is e5, trying to shut this diagonal, closing the bishop out. But Andrew would now have knight a3 hitting the queen, and after, for example, queen to d2, now queen b6 threatens queen b1 with mate. Even though it's guarded by rook and knight, there aren't enough pieces covering that square. And if now, for example, knight to f2, so that the rook on e1 also defends the b1 square, we now have bishop takes e5, which knocks the knight on c3 out of play. And that now means that white cannot prevent either queen to b1, resulting in mate after the captures and a rook ends up on b1, or if the queen on d2 drops back to say d1 to guard the back rank, or goes to d3 to guard b1, then queen to b2 would be mate. So either way, queen b2 or queen b1 will deliver a mate within a few moves. So fabulous game by Andrew, really interesting sort of opening play, quite creative and inventive and flexible play, delaying committing his king to the king side before then finding a wonderful combination to finish the game with that fabulous knight c4 move on move 21. I think this game illustrates Andrew's tactical capability, and Andrew also has a wonderful opening knowledge. So again, anyone facing Andrew in the simultaneous can be assured of playing someone who really is very well schooled in various openings, and you'll be sure to get quite an interesting game with Andrew. So we hope to see you again at the simultaneous on the September the 11th, Saturday the 11th, and hope we will have an interesting day. Okay, thanks.